Hello, everyone. I'm Itai Tevet, Editor-in-Chief of SC Media and Editorial Director at Cyber Risk Alliance. I want to thank you for joining us for today. This is our Winners Roundtable, helping us celebrate our SC Awards, which were just announced. And we are doing an entire series this week, looking at different topics. Today, we are looking at how the threat landscape drove demand for and development of certain capabilities. So put kind of plain and simple, we're going to be talking about the year that was, which needless to say was quite a year. I'm going to do a quick introduction of our panelists today and let everyone know what awards they are recipients of, and then we're going to get right to the discussion. So we have today Gee Rittenhouse, Senior Vice President and General Manager at Cisco Security Business Group. Cisco is our winner for Best Security Company, Best Network Access Control Solution, and Best Solution for the Small and Medium Enterprise. We have Shawn Henry, President of CrowdStrike Services and Chief Security Officer, and he is recipient of our Security Executive of the Year. And we have Itai Tevet, who is CEO of Intezer, winner of our Best Threat Detection Technology. So I want to welcome you all so much and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to just go ahead and kick it off, and I want to kind of look generally that after a year, after more than a year of hard lessons, how did internal priorities shift? And Itai, I might focus first on you because given you all are the winner of our Best Threat Detection Technology, I feel like this year we saw quite a bit in terms of that environment and that shifts in that area that perhaps we did not foresee coming. So as a company that looks in this specific arena and serves customers, how did you view this year in terms of internal prioritizing?
Yeah, good question. So first of all, that was a hell of a year, right, for everybody, for many different reasons. But I would say that there are two main let's say, new priorities for clients that we hear today. First of all is definitely everything related to cloud security. So especially during the pandemic, more and more businesses are shifting to the cloud. The cloud adoption is something that has gone through a few years now, but during that pandemic, it was even accelerated. So we see more and more companies shifting to the cloud and requiring security controls. And we also see the threat landscape and threat actors really seeing the crown jewels in the cloud. So we definitely see a mutual interest in the attackers and defenders on the cloud. And the second thing is definitely related to supply chain attack mitigation, which SolarWinds simply the SolarWinds hack simply brought it to the news headlines. So these are the two places that I think companies are now prioritizing more than the rest.
For you specifically, and I'm going to extend this to the other companies as well, did you look and say, okay, looking at our products, looking at our offerings, we need to really focus our attention in this particular area because this is what customers need in this moment, considering SolarWinds and considering pandemic and some other issues? Did you find yourselves having that kind of conversation?
So we were quite lucky because our expertise as a company is to detect malicious code, and our even bigger expertise is detecting malicious code in the Linux environment. And since Linux powers 90% of cloud infrastructure, it didn't really need to shift any kind of priorities internally within our company. However, I must say that regarding supply chain, we detect malicious code within the infrastructure, but now companies are looking to detect malicious code within third-party libraries and software that is being used. So we definitely had to rethink how we can also cater to that need in terms of malicious code hunting.
Yeah. That's great. And we saw quite a few Linux-focused attacks this year and vulnerabilities. So that, of course, is also extremely timely. Gee, how about you? And Cisco, how did the circumstances of the year, and I'm saying this generally, and they're all very different circumstances, whether you look at the pandemic and taking everybody remote, you look at SolarWinds, you even look at situations like the Microsoft vulnerabilities, which are more recent. But did any of this cause a bit of a narrower focus in certain areas for Cisco internally?
Yeah, what we saw across the industry was, to Itai's earlier point, people are in different parts of the journey of their companies and their businesses. And so we saw an acceleration of certain things like migration to cloud and whatnot, but also the business processes were challenged because a new dynamic was added into their environment, whether it was work from home or migrate to the cloud or do things differently, supply chains and whatnot. And so there was a dynamic that was added into the business environment, which also posed a significant risk. And so where we were focused and where our customers really wanted us to focus was around simplicity and making security really, really simple on behalf of them, because they just struggle with all of the different changes that are going on. And so we focused a lot on our partner community, our supply chain, making sure that our ecosystem was really integrated together, and then providing a very, very simple experience for our customers.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting, Shawn, I'm curious what your thoughts too are in terms of the interactions with those customers, because there was a bit of a reality check that came out of some of the situations this year. And, what kind of response did you get from customers in terms of, wait a minute, are we more vulnerable than we realized? And was it a bit of a light bulb turning on? Shawn, what happened on your side?
Absolutely, Jill. I think it was a wake-up call for organizations that relied on legacy technology, and the sudden shift to the remote workforce and the explosion of the cloud applications really made it imperative to companies to expedite their transformation, similar to what Itai and Gee just said. The lack of capability in the legacy tools made it difficult for companies to detect what was happening in that remote workforce. But let me add another point, because I certainly agree with both of my colleagues here about the infrastructure and the changes that people were making, but the adversaries changed too. They really ramped up their capabilities and their targeting. We saw an increase in about 30% in the targeting, because when people were off the corporate security stack, companies didn't always have the ability to see what was happening. People were working off of unsecured infrastructure. Their technology wasn't being patched. Some of them were using their personal devices. They were storing company or client data, and the adversaries knew it. And by accessing those resources, and in some cases then gaining access down the road back to the corporate network, it was a boon for them. So, this is kind of 360-degree review. Infrastructure, bad. Technology, not so great. Adversaries augmenting their capabilities and their targeting. It led to a very, very difficult year for companies.
Yeah, and it's funny, all of you, I believe, mentioned cloud, and I think, as observers, as journalists, there was, so much reporting we did on folks making the shift, and I feel like the pandemic caused a very rapid shift where suddenly everything was on fast forward as an enabler to be able to operate. So you had both a remote workforce that wasn't necessarily taking security, making security top of mind, but you also had, a rapid transition to the cloud where whether or not the due diligence was taken is, I think, always, a big problem or question. So from all of your perspective, what state are we in now in terms of security? Do we have, we're sort of hinting at coming out of the pandemic, and let's set aside SolarWinds and so forth for now, but looking at the hybrid workforce, which I think we are approaching and is probably going to be permanent, how much cleaning up is there going to be in terms of ensuring that the infrastructure is ready to support that kind of environment? Perhaps this time, Gee, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things that are different this time around. One is the realization that while last year it was the pandemic, next year it may be, a ship stuck in a canal someplace, or so the dynamics, the world dynamics and the global economy and connectedness of everybody has forced customers to think about resilience. So the first couple months of the pandemic, they were very tactical. Let's get in a zero trust policy. Let's get our email up to speed. Let's get a bunch of these things all in place. But after that kind of initial phase, it was much more around resiliency, a dynamic system. How do we respond to these things? And I think that will just continue. So we've made a great progress, but the progress was really in the realization that things can change overnight, and that it will continue to do so. So we see that going forward, playing out across the board.
Yeah, Itai, how about you? What do you see in terms of what folks need to focus on now, where their gaps are as we start to open up the world again, potentially open offices partially? Do you have a lot of people inquiring in that regard?
Yeah, I think again, it's sorry to be repetitive, but it really relates to the first 2 points I mentioned about cloud and supply chain. I think that the more years pass and the cybersecurity market matures, we're still at the stage where it's super easy and cost effective for attackers to launch attacks. And it's super expensive for defenders to do something against them. And I think that equation still doesn't make sense really to me, because crime will always happen. It happened from the beginning of history, but the easiness and the low resources, and again the ROI of cyber attackers to be so amazing, it doesn't really make sense. So I think we still have a lot more to go as an industry in order to sort of like make the equation a bit better. And I think that specifically nowadays, the biggest challenge that we face are definitely cloud and supply chain.
Yeah. I actually want, and Shawn, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Looking a little, well, I guess looking at the pandemic, but also looking at SolarWinds, and we can transition to that a little bit as well. Were we caught flat-footed? Was this a case of, oh, we knew this could happen, and it was inevitable it would at some point in time? Or was this a bit of a shockwave even for the cybersecurity community?
Well, it's funny. I was listening to a radio program just this morning, and they were talking about SolarWinds, and as if it was this new revelation, 5 months after it happened. And I'm wondering, the general public still doesn't have a full understanding, but this is not the first supply chain attack that we've seen. NotPetya was a supply chain attack, and it resulted in hundreds of companies having their parts of their infrastructure physically destroyed and cost globally $10 billion. So this isn't the first time we've seen this. This is going to continue to happen. And we've been talking about supply chain for more than 15 years. And there have been programs in place, different governments that have looked at how do they secure the supply chain for products that are being developed or deployed throughout government agencies. And this is not just in the US, but around the world. So this is certainly not or shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. I think the impact was significant. And I think that people that have recognized what the impact is, they'll certainly pay a lot more attention. When I get questions now from boards of directors, and I talk to them pretty regularly, when they ask right off the bat about SolarWinds, it's gotten their attention. And I think that they recognize the vulnerability they face. To Gee's point, the lack of resiliency if they're not paying attention, and the overall impact to their operations, which is significant. And what does that all mean? It means risk has gone up. And I think when you get key executives and boards focusing on risk, you're going to start to get better implementation of the technology and the types of capabilities that will help to obviate that risk.
It's funny, we did a report, some research that just came out recently that right now, and in this particular report, it was a little focusing on because of the pandemic, but I think in general that there is a spotlight on security professionals and their profile has raised and they are getting the attention like you mentioned, but that potentially it's a window of time. And there is probably a point where people are going to start to forget the risk and to forget that they were vulnerable. So in this window of time, what do you hope your customers will do? And how can we make sure that we perhaps enable a security culture among more of the businesses that you work with and those that you don't work with yet, because perhaps they're not paying enough attention? And that's for anyone. Yeah, Gee, why don't you?
Yeah, I would just say that I think this idea that that security is owned by the chief information security officer or the CIO or reviewed by the board is a very difficult premise. I think that we have entered a phase where security has to be democratized. And we have to as much train the employees and look for things and be able to secure ourselves and then in that ensemble secure the corporation as much as the corporation is from a top-down perspective. And I think Itai said it best. If people are just leaving their software open or not having good hygiene because they don't know, or they're prioritizing something over security, it's just very hard to put protections in place to kind of compensate for that. And so I do think we have to kind of promote an education and not just rely on the security experts and specialists.
Let's make this a little more provocative then, because you may not have meant this, Gee, but I don't think security needs to be democratized. To the extent that it is a whole of company response, that's absolutely true. But I think it needs to be more directed. I've worked in too many companies where different business units are doing what they want, or different geos. Their European unit does something different than their Australian or their US unit, and there's not any directive being given. And without that lack of continuity, that lack of visibility, and that lack of execution, I think we see a lot of gaps that are being exploited. So it absolutely shouldn't be owned. Maybe it's owned from an accountability perspective by a particular executive, but it absolutely is a whole of company response, all business units. Perhaps that's what you meant, but I think it needs to be directed by somebody who owns it and says, this is what we're doing.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think it's all of the above in order to have this kind of holistic view and protect the companies.
Yeah, it's interesting. So Itai, I want to look a little more focused at the supply chain. We've all been talking a little bit about that, and I think again there was a lot of learning that happened this year. But what needs to change from your perspective as a cybersecurity company? How do we get a hold of that? And what sort of expectations need to be established with the software companies and with the suppliers so that you can feel assured as a customer, as a user, that proper security is being put in place? I mean, what do we do about this?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I think that the entire industry is trying to answer now. It's a small question, but very complicated. And I really, really agree with what Shawn mentioned. Supply chain attacks is not something new. My background is mostly military, and I remember Operation Aurora by the Chinese government, hacked Google, Adobe, a bunch of stuff. NotPetya, Shawn mentioned as well. But something about SolarWinds created an awareness that I haven't seen in the past, or shall I say, the one time I have saw a similar awareness was in 2013 with the Target hacks that sparked a huge demand in the industry, suddenly shifting from AVs to EDRs and all that.
Yeah.
So I see the same order of magnitude of events right now in terms of awareness. So sorry to segue a bit off, but to answer your question, I think we need to combine technology and process to create some kind of better vendor to consumer trust. Because right now, I don't think it's in the best shape possible. Also technology and also processes. Both should be improved. That's my personal opinion.
Yeah. Does there need to be like, we hear about a software bill of materials and that sort of scenario where there needs to be very clear and detailed accounting of components and of patches and, licensing scenarios. It's easier said than done, I would argue, but do you think we're going to end up going down that road where that will be necessary for the software companies to provide to the customers?
Might be a step in the right direction, but I know I dealt in the past with the best attackers in the world, and they don't care about your compliance, and they don't care about how much you detail your third-party libraries. So I think that it might be a good step, but again, it's in addition to the processes that need to be better, the technology should take a step forward.
Yeah. Shawn, what role does government, we've seen government actually in the last few days do quite a bit. It's been interesting to see the Biden administration come out, not just with sanctions, but they had a bit of a role, or the court system certainly did, in the Microsoft situation. And they had groups that were looking at the SolarWinds and Microsoft situation. What role does government have to offset some of the threats and vulnerabilities that we're facing? And how do we need that collaboration with industry to evolve?
I could spend a couple of hours on this question, but given the length of time we have, I'll start with one. The number one priority for the government in this space is deterrence. How can the government deter adversaries? It might be through law enforcement actions that arrest organized crime groups. It may be through some type of financial sanctions or diplomatic actions that deter nation states. It might be through some government action, offensive action. But the government's primary role in this space is deterrence, because the private sector you cannot put private sector individuals up against trained military units, which is what is happening right now every single day. Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, using their highly capable military units to target the private infrastructure. You need government to deter. And to do that, they've got to put a whole program in place. I think at the end of the day, there needs to be nation state to nation state discussions about what's acceptable and what's not, and what the repercussions are going to be if you cross those red lines. Because until we have that and really define the norms, these attacks go on indefinitely because the ROI is so significant, and the chance of being caught or having some type of actions taken against you is very slim. I appreciate what just happened with the recent administration and the actions taken against Russia, but I think that there has not been enough of that long term.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because it was a number of years ago. I remember reporting about the whole theory that NATO was declaring it was a bit of a Article 5 situation, that cybersecurity could be treated like an act of war, but it was also very much it depends on the circumstances. And I suppose that's fair and that's appropriate, but what's going to make a country like Russia necessarily adhere to what the US and other allies are asking of them? I mean, what is it going to take? Sanctions have always, they work to some degree, but, are the players out of Russia, out of China? I mean, is this really going to have an impact?
It becomes a risk calculus again, like anything else. In the physical world, that's the way it works, right? In the physical world, security deterrence is the government's primary role, to keep its citizens safe, and they do it primarily through deterrence, whether it be military or in the crime crime genre. I think in this space, it's got to be fear, or where they recognize their risk is high, and that if they take certain actions, there's going to be some type of response.
Yeah. Gee, looking at what recently took place with the Department of Justice and stepping in a bit to address some of the vulnerabilities tied to Microsoft Exchange. I think generally there was a lot of embrace of that tactic. But when is it government's role to kind of step in and get involved in what could be defined as private sector systems? I mean, they were really kind of getting them involved in the security of private systems. When is that the right way to go?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think, by the way, I completely agree with Shawn on the deterrence. Even though it may appear to, like, sanctions or whatever may have questionable results, the fact that you state it and follow up with it actually has real consequences. And I think the same is true. The government also has a responsibility to the citizens around compliance and regulatory issues. So just like we want to know what's in our food, we want to know what's inside of our vulnerabilities from a cyber perspective as well. And so I do think that the government can provide a framework and a construct of which people can expose rules and regulations about if something is happening, how transparent we are and whatnot. Government can play a huge role there without having to specifically get in there and patch our systems for us and do those kind of things.
Yeah, it's interesting. The other thing I'll note that seemed to come out of all of these situations, at least from my perspective, is a rather refreshing cooperation and collaboration among the cybersecurity community, among companies like yourselves. There seemed to be a lot of information sharing and transparency and building upon one another's work. And I'm sure that's been happening always, but it seemed to me even more so, or that the community stepped up. How is that relationship? Do you see that expanding? And was it more so than what you've seen in the past in terms of how the community kind of worked together? Itai, how about we start with you on that one?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I see more and more research collaboration, more and more derivative work, which is good, from open source projects. And I don't think it's just about, simply kumbaya or all good, but it really affects positively business for companies, because you can actually create something better that works better for your clients. And it's amazing. And I think that we have seen quite a lot of this community and open source mentality in other industries.
Yeah.
And I think that it's time that the security space will even embrace it even more, because there is some kind of, natural secrecy and to our industry, but I think it's more and more becoming like transparent, open, collaborative. So I think we are headed to a better future in that aspect.
Yeah, that's terrific. So I'm going to ask each of you for a closing remark. Unfortunately, I think we're pretty close to time here from what I can see. On whether you feel we are going to move into this year with a silver lining of a more educated community, and I don't mean cybersecurity community, but business community, in terms of the risks, in terms of the importance and significance of security as a priority for the survival of their business, to be honest, or whether we're going to find ourselves in this situation a year from now without much having changed. What do you hope will come of this? Shawn, why don't we start with you?
Well, I think, first of all, security can't be seen as a cost center. If all of your assets and your intellectual property and your employees and your customer data, your IP and R&D, if that's not important to you, then you probably shouldn't be in business. You've got to invest in security. I think the digital transformation for companies is critical, and it's got to be a top priority for them. And then beyond that, I think as we talk about this move back from from COVID, we still are going to have this work from anywhere philosophy where companies are going to have people working remotely. They've got to embrace the cloud. I think that that's the right direction to provide visibility. It's the world we're living in. And as technology continues to increase, people have that sense of mobility and the opportunities to engage in new technologies. They're going to be required to use the cloud to secure their infrastructure and maintain that level of visibility and speed to allow for resiliency.
Yeah, absolutely. Itai, how about you next?
One minute to think.
Okay, it's true. I sprung a question on you, didn't I? What change, what difference do you hope will come of this somewhat of a mess of a year that we've had?
Yeah. Well, I really hope that one thing that will happen is a bit more organization in the mess in terms of the solutions that are marketed. And I'll explain. One thing that I hear across the board from clients is that they're very confused with all the solutions in the space, and it's hard for them to navigate. So I hope also as an industry, we can have some kind of way to better navigate our clients, to tell them, how they can keep themselves secure and navigate through all this a noise of the market, because I think that we are creating a lot of the noise ourselves. We should do a better job in that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I would argue as a journalist that we all have to get a little bit away from the buzzwords that mean a whole lot to the industry, but don't mean a whole lot to the market at large, the business community. All right, Gee, final thoughts.
Yeah, final thoughts. Well, first of all, I just want to congratulate Shawn and Itai for winning these awards. Fantastic job, and it's not a surprise. I would say that, again, coming back to the resilience, there were a lot of companies that we've supported and helped that were before the pandemic had a fairly fixed environment, and whether it was by choice, by regulation, compliance, or whatnot. And the pandemic has shown that you can operate your business very differently. And through this, security remained top of mind. It wasn't. It was one of the first decisions you had to do. So I think that in many ways, companies are a little bit more aware of security and in an environment that is constantly changing. And I think as a silver lining, perhaps, that will leave us a little bit stronger from a security perspective after this event or this year than last year.
Yeah, terrific. Good. So that's hopeful. I see optimism in your statement. I want to take a moment to congratulate all of you for the awards, and really to thank you probably on behalf of the community for the good work. I think this was the year to win awards. This year means that you all were working very hard. But I encourage our audience to please do give a look at all of our coverage of the SC Awards this year. A lot of really fantastic individuals and companies and products were recognized. And keep an eye, this is one of our series of videos that we are doing with our winners. So please do refer back to scmagazine.com, and we hope to see you all very soon. Thank you all for participating.
Thanks very much, Jill. Congratulations, guys.
Thank you so much.